Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we'll be doing some more of the executive branch. We'll be talking about two branches and the first secretaries of them, which were under George Washington. First branch we want to talk about is the Department of State. Established in 1789, essentially serves as a foreign minister and is the U.S.'s chief diplomat and representative abroad. Now, currently they are headquartered in the Harry S. Truman Building, which is blocks from the White House. They were originally called the Department of Foreign Affairs before legislation actually changed the name to the Department of State 2 months later. And they are led by the Secretary of State, with several positions beneath. The position actually started under the Articles of Confederation, but it was brought over as a part of the executive branch under the Constitution. So, now, the first Secretary of State is John Jay. He was born on December the 12th, 1745. His parents were French Huguenot refugees, and he was educated in a French Huguenot church school and then continued his education at King's College, which is now known as Columbia University. He was a clerk for a prominent New York attorney and was admitted to the bar in 1768. He opened his own law office in 1771. He married 17-year-old Sarah Van Brugh Livingston in 1774. She was 17, he was 28. Now, he represented New York at the First Continental Congress and was originally wanted peace with Britain, but he ended up deciding on independence after a number of British incursions into the U.S. and events. So, in 1778, he was appointed president of the Continental Congress, and then in the next year, in 1779, he was appointed diplomat to Spain. Finally, he would be appointed Secretary of Foreign Affairs while the country was still under the Articles of Confederation. Once the Constitution was adopted, he held his place until Washington's original choice for Secretary of State could arrive. But so he was just a temporary Secretary of State, even though he was technically first. But he would die on May the 17th, 1829. Now, the person he was holding the office for was actually Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was born on April the 13th, 1743, and he studied at the College of William and Mary before reading law. He was a voracious reader and would have his own small personal library of several thousand books. He was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767. In 1768, he began construction of Monticello and would then be elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769, representing Albemarle County from 1769 to 1775. In 1772, he married 23-year-old Martha Wells Skelton Jefferson. Jefferson was 28, and like I said, she was 23. She was recently widowed, and she was actually his third cousin, so she was a bit related to him. In 1775, he was named commander of the Albemarle County, Virginia militia. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, which, he wrote the majority of the document, although others contributed. He was the primary author. Then he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in September of 1776. He was a strong proponent of freedom of and from religion. This can be seen several times in his works. He was elected governor of Virginia in 1779 and 1780, serving as the second governor of Virginia. He moved the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, but then his wife would pass away in 1782. Jefferson would be appointed to Congress in 1783 to represent Virginia. So remember, this is still under the Articles of Confederation. In 1784, he was sent as a minister plenipotentiary to France. In 1787, while still in Paris, he sent for his youngest daughter, Polly, who was accompanied by Sally Hemings. And this is where they would have their sexual relationship. She was only 14, Jefferson was 44. But nevertheless, they had a relationship that would produce heirs. In 1789, under the newly adopted Constitution, he was appointed Secretary of State, but unable to take office immediately, and thus that's why we have John Jay take office, because he's having to come back to the U.S. He would serve as Secretary of State from 1790 to 1793, would be elected Vice President in 1796, then elected President in 1800, and while President, he would have such events as the Lewis and Clark exploration of territory he purchases, called the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the nation. He would spend 2 terms in office, and in 1819 he would found the University of Virginia. He would then pass away on July the 4th, 1826. Now, next person to take over as Secretary of State was Edmund Randolph, who was born on August the 10th, 1753. He was educated at the College of William and Mary, studied law in the law office of his father. With war right around the corner, his parents were actually loyalists, so they headed back to England with a number of his siblings. He actually went with them at first, but would come right back. And in that same year, 1775, he would join the Continental Army as an aide-de-camp to General George Washington. So there he has his first connection to Washington. In the October of 1775, his uncle, Peyton Randolph, would pass away, which would make Edmund the executor of his uncle's estate, requiring him to come back to Virginia. He would marry Elizabeth Nicholas in 1776, and then was one of the 11 delegates sent to represent Virginia at the Continental Congress in 1776. He would then go into private practice law before being elected governor of Virginia, its 7th. And he was the first attorney general under the new Constitution. So he started off as attorney general first, but would take Secretary of State after Jefferson leaves. But he would serve as attorney general from 1789 to 1794. And as I said, he would take over for Jefferson and serve as Secretary of State from 1794 to 1795. He then would go back to being a lawyer before passing away on September the 12th, 1813. Now, the next person we want to talk about, the last Secretary of State under Washington, was Timothy Pickering, who was born on July the 17th, 1745 in Salem, Massachusetts. He would graduate from Harvard University in 1763 and would be admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1768. Now, in 1774, he became the Essex County Register of Deeds. Shortly after, he would be elected to represent Salem, Massachusetts General Court. He would then serve as Justice of the Essex County Court of Common Pleas. In April of 1775, he would lead some men in a military confrontation in what is now known as Leslie's Retreat. He would marry Rebecca White in April of 1776. General George Washington would make him an adjutant general in 1777. In August of 1780, he became quartermaster general. In 1783, he had a failed mercantile business attempt with Samuel Hodgson. In 1786, he would move to Pennsylvania to hold several offices in Luzerne County. In 1794, he was appointed commissioner to the Iroquois Indians by President Washington. But this was also at the time he was Postmaster General. which he held that post from 1791 to 1795. He would take over being Secretary of State in 1795 and hold it until 1800. He would be named a senator from Massachusetts in 1803 for one term. Then he would be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from 1812 to 1817 and would then farm the rest of his life until he passed away on January the 29th, 1829. Now, let's look at the Department of the Treasury. It oversees the U.S. Mint and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, so it controls a lot of federal money and Federal Reserve notes. It takes care of the printing of bills and coins and all this, so it collects federal taxes through the IRS and manages the U.S. debt instruments, licenses and supervises banks, and advises legislative and executive offices on fiscal matters. So it deals a lot with the U.S.'s monetary matters. Led by the Secretary of the Treasury, it was created by an act of Congress under the Constitution because of difficulties in funding the Revolution, because they would have trouble in paying the soldiers. So yeah. The first person we're going to talk about was the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. He was born January the 11th, 1755 in Charlestown, Nevis, what is now St. Kitts and Nevis. His father would abandon the family in 1765. His father was like a wandering merchant, and he would eventually end up abandoning the family, like I said, in 1765. At age 11, he became a clerk for a New York counting house in St. Croix. So the counting house was based, their home was in New York, but this particular counting house branch he worked in was in St. Croix. His mother would pass away in 1768. So remember, he loses his father, who just leaves in 1765, and then his mother dies in 1768. And at this point, he's only 13-year-old. He would become a ward of relatives of his mother. With them, he went to school in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. In 1773, he started at King's College, which, as we discussed earlier, is now known as Columbia University. The Revolutionary War was started, which forced him to stop his studies at the college because it had to be closed down. He would be married to Elizabeth Schuyler in 1780, and then after he would have some military service. During his military service, he participated in the Battle of Princeton on January the 3rd, 1777. He was offered a position as an aide for several of the young country's generals. serving in the Revolutionary Army as an aide to several of the generals, but he would turn them down, but eventually decided to accept the position of an aide for General George Washington and would become the chief aide for him for 4 years. So again, there's that connection Washington has with these men. So he was given command of a battalion on July the 31st, 1781. He would then resign his post at the start of 1782, and after some self-study would actually pass the bar in that same year, 1782, and even later would become a receiver of continental taxes for the state of New York. He was appointed to Congress under the Articles of Confederation in July of 1782 and would take office in November of 1782. Hamilton would be frustrated by the decentralized power of Congress and thus its lack of ability to collect taxes. So remember, the U.S. was still under the Articles of Confederation, which gave most of the ability to states. There was no strong centralized government, and thus it had no real power to do anything. Thus, while there was not even an executive branch, no president, we essentially had a Congress. That was it. And so, again, we had this problem in paying our former soldiers. Hamilton would resign from the Congress under the Articles of Confederation in 1783. In 1784, he would found the Bank of New York. In 1787, he would serve as an assemblyman from New York County in the New York State Legislature. He was chosen as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention as a representative of New York. He was one of 3 primary authors of the Federalist Papers. Those authors were himself, Alexander Hamilton, as well as John Jay and James Madison. He would be appointed the first Secretary of the Treasury under the Constitution by former General George Washington on September the 11th, 1789. He would leave as Secretary of the Treasury on January the 31st, 1795, having given 2 months' notice prior to. So he went back to practicing law, but in 1797, he would become the first American politician involved in a huge public sex scandal, which was known as the Reynolds Affair scandal. Hamilton would die in a duel with Aaron Burr on July the 12th, 1804. He was actually shot on July the 11th, but it was July the 12th when he succumbed to the wounds. So, yeah. And the last person from the Treasury and on video today we're going to talk about would be Oliver Walcott Jr. He would take over for Hamilton. He was born on January the 11th, 1760 in Litchfield, Connecticut. He would serve in the Continental Army from 1777 to 1779 and graduate from Yale University in 1778. He would be the clerk of Connecticut's Commission on Pay Table from 1781 to 1782. He would then become a member of the Connecticut Committee on Pay Table from 1782 to 1784. He would then become the commissioner to settle claims of Connecticut against the United States, 1784 to 1788. He would then become comptroller of public accounts for Connecticut, 1788 and 1789. Then he would become auditor for the U.S. Department of the Treasury in 1789 to 1791. Then become comptroller for the U.S. Department of the Treasury from 1791 to 1795. He would become the second Secretary of the Treasury in 1795, serving to 1800, taking over for Hamilton. He would become a federal judge from February the 20th of 1801 to July the 1st of 1802. He would then become a farmer, and finally, he would serve as the 24th governor of Connecticut in 1817 to 1827, before passing away on June the 1st, 1833. But yeah, that was going to be everything for this video. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting sources in the description below the video. See you all in the next one. Until then, later.